So we should add fetch tasks as a dependency here to useEffect, because you learned that basically every piece of data or function which is set up inside of a component function which you are using in useEffect should be added as a dependency. The problem with that, and therefore you shouldn't save this file yet, is that this would create an infinite loop. Why? Because we will call fetch tasks here, and this will then go ahead and execute this send request function in the custom hook, and that will then set some states. When the states are set, the component where we use the custom hook will be re-rendered. Because I explained that when you use a custom hook, which uses state, and you use that hook in a component, that component will implicitly use that state set up in the custom hook. So the state configured in the custom hook is attached to the component where you use the custom hook. So if we call set is loading and set error here in the send request function in the custom hook, this will trigger the app component to be re-evaluated because I'm using that custom hook here in that component. Now that, however, will then call the custom hook again when that component is re-evaluated. And when that custom hook is called again, I am indeed recreating the send request function, and I'm returning a new function object, and therefore useEffect will run again. And that happens because, as I explained earlier in the course, in the behind the scenes module, functions are objects in JavaScript, and every time a function is recreated, even if it contains the same logic, it's a brand new object in memory. And therefore useEffect would treat it as a new value, even if it's technically the same function, and it would re-execute it. So, to avoid this, we should go to use HTTP and wrap send request with use callback, which we can do also when we use async await in there. This is no problem. So we import use callback and then wrap this function here with use callback. Now use callback also needs a dependency array though, and this dependency array also should list everything which is being used in here. And in my case, that is, for example, that request config object, but also this apply data function which we're calling. Now, this poses yet another problem though. Since that is the case, we should add request config and apply data as dependencies here. But of course, both, again, are objects. Request config is a standard JavaScript object. Apply data is a function, which you learned also is an object. So back in the app component, where we're passing in this object and this function, we again have to ensure that these objects are not recreated all the time when this function runs again, which they currently would be. So here in app component, we also should import use callback and wrap transform tasks here with use callback, for example, and add our dependency array here. And here we don't have to add anything, because in here I'm not using anything external other than set tasks, which is a state updating function. And as explained multiple times in the course, these are guaranteed to never change. And if this is looking cumbersome, yeah, it can be tricky to get into. It might look like a lot of work, but it is something you're getting used to over time, and it is very logical in the end. It is simply related to how JavaScript works after all. Now with that, we're guaranteeing that transform tasks will not change all the time, but this object here will. We are recreating it here all the time whenever the app component is re-evaluated. So to work around that, we could look into use memo or anything like that to ensure that this object doesn't change all the time, or we change our custom hook again. Instead of accepting the request config here in the hook itself, why don't we expect it here in the send request function? After all, that is the function which is being called with that config. So we could expect this request config object not here in use HTTP, but here in send request. So here. Then we don't need to add it as a dependency here, because it's now a parameter of this wrapped function, not an external dependency. And therefore we got rid of this issue, and in app component, all we gotta do is take this object with the URL and remove it here, so that transform tasks is the only function we're passing to use HTTP. And we then go to fetch tasks, where we are sending the request in the end. Keep in mind that fetch tasks is just send requests because of this aliasing here. And we pass our config object here. That's something we could do. And of course, we could do something similar with the data transformation function. If using use callback here in app component is too cumbersome for you, if you don't like this approach, we can get rid of that and instead just pass transform tasks as a second argument to fetch tasks here and not to use HTTP, so that we call use HTTP without any arguments. And we actually create transform tasks. Whoops, get rid of the dependencies here. We create transform tasks like this inside of the effect. Then this also is no external dependency in the effect. And now we make sure that use HTTP, our custom hook, can be called without any dependencies or without any parameters, because we're passing the request-specific configuration and the data transformation that should be applied after the request was sent directly to the request. And I showed both alternatives because both would be viable ways of doing it, and I also wanted to show you what the potential downfalls or disadvantages of the other approach are. Now, of course, we need to go to use HTTP and not expect apply data here as a parameter of the custom hook, but instead here for send request. And with that, of course, use callback here in our custom hook has no dependencies anymore, because all the data it's operating on is received as parameters in the wrapped functions. We got no external dependencies here. And with all of that, if we go back to app.js, we now have code that should run without an infinite loop and without any issues. If we now go back and reload, the tasks are still being fetched. And again, I'm fully aware of the fact that this can be confusing. I hope I could still explain why the different steps were needed. Of course, I could have shown you that final solution right from the start, but it is super important to understand that there are different ways of achieving this, and the other solution wasn't bad or wrong. This is just a solution which minimizes the number of dependencies, makes this a bit easier to manage, but the other solution would have been fine as well. And most importantly, I wanted to make it clear why we derived this solution now and why I'm going with this solution now. With all of that though, the hook is looking good and app.js works, but of course the main reason for adding the hook in the first place was to reuse logic across components. And here in the app component we're fine now, but we still got our new task component, where we also are sending a request. So let's use our custom hook there as a next step. So here in new task, I also want to use my custom hook. And therefore, first of all, we should import use HTTP from hooks use HTTP. Then we can call use HTTP, and we no longer need to pass in any parameters because of the refactoring work we did in the last lecture. Now we still get back an object though, which we can destructure, where we get access to isLoading, to the error, and to send request. And here I will rename send request to send task request. But that of course is up to you. We can get rid of the two states here now and of the use state import therefore, because we're using our custom hook for this now. Now in the enter task handler, we in the end want to call send task request now. We want to call that here because we want to send that request whenever enter task handler is triggered, which happens when that form was submitted in the end. Therefore, we will soon delete all that code, but before we do that, we need to ensure that we pass the proper configuration and data handling function to send request. And for this, let's start with the config object. I pass in a new object where the URL is set to this URL. And here now, since I want to set a post request, I'll also set the method to post. And I'll set the headers here to the headers object, which I got down there, like this. And I will, of course, also add a body, however, not as JSON, because we're doing that JSON transformation inside of the custom hook here. But instead, I will therefore just send in this object here, which I previously changed to JSON in the new task component. So that's my request config object now. The second argument is a function which takes the response data and does something with it. And the something I want to do with it is in the end this down here. I want to extract the generated ID, which Firebase gives me automatically. I want to create a task object which incorporates that ID, and I then want to call props on add task. So we could either create this function on the fly here, or we create it in advance, like this here, the create task function, let's say. And here I get my data, my task data as an argument. And then we grab this logic from down there, this logic, copy that, and add this here in create task. And data is now renamed to task data like this. And we now use create task to pass this as a second argument here to send task request. We don't need to work with use callback or anything like this here, because we are only calling send task request in the enter task handler, not inside of use effect or anything like that. Therefore, here we won't have the problem of an infinite loop, because this request will not be sent whenever the component is re-evaluated, but only when this function runs, which happens when the form is submitted. That was different in the app component. There we sent the request inside of use effect, and therefore we had the danger of sending the request too often. In new task, we should be fine now. And therefore we can grab this old code here and get rid of all of that, so that inside of the enter task handler, I'm now only calling send task request, and we're configuring it like this. Now in my create task function, I'm missing the task text though. That's a problem. I'm missing the text which was, passed from the form to that HTTP request. We do have that text available here inside of enter task handler. To make it available inside of this create task function, which we pass to send task request, we got two main options. We could either grab this function and define it here inside of enter task handler to have a nested function inside of a nested function inside of the component function. And that would work. Due to how JavaScript scoping works, we now do have access to the entered task text. Or alternatively, we leave it like this to avoid this deep nesting, and we instead expect to get the task text as an argument here, as a parameter in create task text. And therefore we want two parameters here, when actually our custom hook, which is calling create task in the end, only passes in one parameter. It only passes in data. To work around that, we could use the bind method in JavaScript. We could call bind here on create task when we pass it to send task request. And the bind method allows us to pre-configure a function. It does not execute the function right away. Instead, it's a default JavaScript method, which you can use on any function object to pre-configure that function. The first argument you pass to bind then allows you to set the this keyword in the to be executed function, which does not matter to us here, hence we can set this to null. But the second argument you pass to bind will then be the first argument received by that to-be-called function. So if we want to pass in the task text here, we can set this to task text here, because that will then refer to the task text we're getting from the form submission. Now, the other argument, task data, will still be received here, because this is our pre-configuration. Any other arguments which might be passed by the place where the function is then actually being called, which happens in use HTTP, will then simply be appended to the end of the parameter list. So the data, which we pass here as the only argument to apply data in the custom hook, will be appended as a second argument on create task because of us calling bind here. So when it's being called, this receives all the data which is needed. And this is all just regular JavaScript. This has nothing to do with React or with hooks or anything like that. That's just regular JavaScript. You can learn more about the bind method and about pre-configuring functions with a resource which you find attached to this lecture. And therefore now, if I save this, we can reload and still load all tasks. But if I now send another task, if I click add task, we see sending here. And then we see, does this work? So if I reload, it's also still there. We can also see all that data on Firebase. Now, if I open the console, I also got no errors there. And if we go to the network tab, we also see that indeed we are not sending an infinite amount of requests or anything like that. Instead, if I clear this and I test this, we are in the end just sending one request. It looks like two, but this is just a side request which is sent along the way. And therefore, this is all looking good. And that is how we can build a custom hook for sending HTTP requests. It definitely had its tricky parts, but with it, we now have this custom hook which outsources or which holds a lot of the duplicate logic, especially all that stateful logic, and we can use it in different components to send different kinds of requests and do different kinds of things with the response data and still utilize this shared loading and error state and this shared logic.